One warm afternoon, the peaceful park in the heart of the small town buzzed with the sounds of children laughing and playing. Parents sat on benches, chatting quietly, while their kids ran around, carefree and happy. Everything seemed normal until a call came through the town's police dispatcher. There was a disturbance at the park. Officer Harris, a seasoned officer known for his strict manner, was dispatched to investigate. He arrived in his patrol car and parked near the entrance. As he stepped out, the noise of children playing became louder. A group of kids was gathered near a small picnic table, where 9-year-old Mia, a black girl, was speaking passionately. "Stop! That's not fair!" Mia's voice rang out clearly as she stood defiantly in front of an older boy who had been picking on her friends. "You can't just take their toys and push them around." The boy rolled his eyes, but before he could respond, Mia's friend stepped in, rallying behind her. The group of children stood their ground, refusing to back down. Officer Harris approached the scene, his usual calm conduct. However, as he observed the situation, his focus immediately shifted to Mia. He didn't hear the full context of the situation, just a young black girl speaking out loudly and refusing to back down. "Girl," he called gently, though his tone held an edge of authority, "come here. You can't act like this." "I'm just talking. What did I do wrong?" Mia asked, her voice filled with confusion. She glanced toward her mother, who was sitting a few feet away, eyes widening as she took in the scene. "You're creating a disturbance," Harris said firmly, stepping closer. His hand hovered near his radio, ready to call for backup. But I'm not hurting anyone," Mia exclaimed, her voice growing louder. "I'm just standing up for my friends." "Enough," Harris snapped, his tone rising as he stepped closer. "You're coming with me." Mia's eyes filled with tears as she shook her head furiously. "No, I didn't do anything wrong. Why are you doing this?" Harris didn't respond. His hand gently but firmly grabbed Mia's arm, and she tried to pull away. But his grip was steady, not rough, yet enough to control her movements. "Mia!" her mother yelled, standing up quickly. "Stop! You can't do this!" Harris turned his head slightly, giving Mia's mother a stern look. "I'm handling this situation. Please step back." "No!" Mia's mother cried, rushing forward. "You're making a mistake!" But Harris was already walking towards his patrol car with Mia in tow. She continued to struggle, tears streaming down her face as her mother shouted behind her. The other children and parents watched in shock, their faces showing disbelief and confusion. No one had expected the situation to escalate this quickly. The park, once filled with laughter and carefree energy, was now silent and tense. Mia was placed in the back of the police car, still crying as Harris settled into the driver's seat. He glanced at her in the rearview mirror but said nothing. The silence in the car was deafening. Only the hum of the engine and the occasional sniffle from Mia could be heard. They drove in silence to the town's small police station, where the paperwork was already waiting. Officer Harris was used to handling adults in distress, not children. Yet something about Mia's refusal to back down stirred something in him, though he wasn't quite sure what. When they arrived at the station, Mia was processed like any other suspect. Her mother followed closely behind, demanding to speak with the officer in charge. Harris ignored her as he directed Mia into a holding area designed for juveniles. It wasn't meant to be harsh, just a simple room with chairs and a table. Nothing intimidating. Mia sat down, wiping her tears with the sleeve of her hoodie. Her mother barged into the room moments later, her voice shaking with anger. "This is unacceptable," her mother shouted, pacing back and forth. "She's 9 years old. You're making a mistake." Harris remained silent, filling out paperwork at his desk. He glanced up briefly at Mia's mother, but didn't respond. "You should be ashamed of yourself," Mia's mother continued. "You're ruining her childhood for what? For standing up for what's right?" Harris took a deep breath, trying to maintain his professionalism. "I'm just following protocol," he said calmly, though his voice had an edge. "Protocol? Arresting a 9-year-old girl for speaking out?" her mother demanded, her voice raising again. "This isn't about protocol. It's about power, and you're abusing it." Harris's gaze lowered to his desk. He wasn't here to debate morality, especially in this situation. His focus was on the law, and according to him, Mia had disrupted the peace. After what felt like hours, Mia's father arrived at the station. His face was grim, his eyes narrowing as he took in the situation. He said nothing at first, choosing instead to embrace his daughter tightly as she continued to cry. "I didn't do anything, Daddy," Mia whispered into his chest. "I just wanted them to stop." Her father's jaw tightened as he looked toward Harris, his eyes blazing with anger. "What kind of world are we living in where a child gets arrested for speaking up?" Harris said nothing. The atmosphere in the small room was tense. Every second passing felt heavier. Back at the park, the news spread like wildfire. Parents posted on social media, demanding answers. Activists organized protests, calling for justice not just for Mia, but for all children who had faced unjust treatment. The community's voice grew louder, and soon the entire town was talking about the incident. At home, Mia couldn't sleep. The sound of her mother's voice echoing through the house only reminded her of what had happened. She wondered if anyone would believe her version of the story, if anyone would care enough to make a change. In the coming days, Officer Harris would learn that his actions had ignited a fire in the community, a fire that wouldn't be easily put out. Days turned into weeks, and the community's outrage over Mia's arrest showed no signs of slowing down. The protests continued, growing larger with each passing day. Parents, students, teachers, and activists marched together, their voices rising in unison, demanding justice. Justice for Mia was no longer just a hashtag, it had become a rallying cry for change. At the center of this movement was Mia herself. Though she had initially been hesitant about becoming the face of the protests, her confidence grew with the support of her family and friends. She spoke at community gatherings, sharing her story of being unfairly targeted, highlighting how racism had played a significant role in her arrest. Her words resonated deeply with many people, sparking personal reflections and discussions about systemic racism in their town. Meanwhile, Officer Harris remained on administrative leave. His days were spent indoors, avoiding public spaces where he might face criticism. His superiors were watching closely, aware of the mounting pressure from the community. Conversations about reform began circulating within the police department, with many officers expressing unease about how situations like Mia's could be avoided in the future. One evening, as Mia sat in her room, flipping through her favorite storybook, her father entered with a determined look on his face. "Mia," he began softly, sitting beside her on the bed. "I want you to know how proud I am of you. What you're doing isn't easy, but you're making a difference. A lot of people are listening now." Mia smiled faintly, her voice quiet but steady. "I just told the truth, Daddy. I didn't do anything wrong." Her father gently hugged her, his grip firm yet gentle. "That truth is powerful, sweetheart, and people need to hear it." Back at City Hall, the Marintown Council faced growing pressure to address the systemic issues of racism and discrimination in policing. Several task forces were formed to evaluate how officers were trained, particularly in situations involving Black children and marginalized communities. Activists, community leaders, and even some officers began participating in these discussions, pushing for policies that would ensure accountability and fairness. During a public forum, Mia's mother, Lisa, stood before a large crowd, her voice steady and resolute. "Our children deserve to feel safe, not afraid. They deserve to be heard, not silenced. Racism exists, and we cannot ignore it any longer." Her words echoed through the hall, and the crowd responded with applause. Many parents and citizens shared their own experiences with bias and injustice at the hands of law enforcement. The atmosphere was charged with emotion, anger, sadness, and hope. Meanwhile, Officer Harris watched from a distance. He had been advised to stay out of public view, but his discomfort grew with every passing day. Though he acknowledged his mistake, the weight of it seemed unbearable. He couldn't escape the constant reminders, the protests, the media coverage, the conversations happening all over town. One evening, he sat alone in his small apartment, staring out the window. The city lights flickered, but inside, his thoughts were dark. He replayed the events at the park over and over in his mind, wondering if there was a different way he could have handled it. "Maybe," he muttered quietly to himself, "maybe if I had listened, if I had truly seen her as just a child, not as a problem." Back in the community, the atmosphere was a mixture of hope and determination. Protests had shifted into conversations, community workshops, town hall meetings, and educational sessions. Schools began incorporating discussions about racial bias into their curriculum, and students led initiatives to create safe spaces for Black children and other marginalized groups. At one such workshop, Mia stood alongside other young activists. She was invited to share her story once more, her voice a beacon of hope for the future. "This isn't just about me," Mia said passionately. "This is about all the other kids who are treated unfairly because of the color of their skin. We have to change the system, not just demand it. We have to work together for real change." The room erupted in applause. Parents and educators alike listened intently, their eyes reflecting a mix of pride and sorrow. For many, Mia's words were a call to action, a reminder that change starts with understanding, empathy, and courage. As the weeks passed, the investigation into Harris continued. A growing number of testimonies from the community painted a picture of a system where Black children were disproportionately targeted and criminalized. The evidence was clear. There was a deeply rooted bias within the law enforcement system. One evening during a town hall meeting, the chief of police made an unexpected statement. "We must acknowledge our mistakes," he said. "This system has failed, and it's time for reform. We hear you." A ripple of applause spread throughout the room, but the work was far from over. Activists, leaders, and the community knew that change required more than just words. It required action. For Mia, the journey was far from finished. Every step forward was met with new challenges, but with each passing day, she felt stronger. The small girl who once cried in the back of a police car had become a symbol of resilience and hope. A reminder that even in the face of injustice, voices matter. The town was in a constant state of motion. Protests had turned into discussions, and discussions had led to action. Mia's story had captured the attention of not just the community, but of activists and organizations across the state. Her parents continued to advocate fiercely, pushing for reforms that would prevent future injustices. However, not everyone in the town welcomed the change. While many were on Mia's side, some still held on to outdated beliefs. Racism, as much as it was being exposed, was not an easy demon to fight. In Officer Harris's mind, the weight of guilt grew heavier with each passing day. The small gestures of accountability, the administrative leave, the brief apology, felt inadequate. He replayed his actions, the way he had looked at Mia, how he had assumed her loudness was a problem rather than a voice that needed to be heard. His days were spent in isolation. He avoided social media, kept conversations with colleagues minimal, and stayed out of public spaces. Yet the absence of noise didn't help. In silence, the voices echoed louder. Voices that once screamed injustice. Voices that challenged authority. Voices that demanded fairness. In the community, those voices continued to multiply. Mia's friends were no longer silent. At school, they formed clubs, creating platforms for discussions on race, justice, and inclusion. Teachers who once hesitated to speak on the sensitive topics began holding forums and lesson plans that delved into the complexities of racial disparities. Did you know that Black students are suspended at a higher rate than white students for the same behavior? A teacher said at one such forum. These are uncomfortable truths we need to face. Parents, too, began to question the education system. They demanded changes in policies, curriculum revisions, and the inclusion of more diverse perspectives in classrooms. Mia's story wasn't just about a single incident. It became a catalyst for broader, systemic change. At the heart of the movement was Mia herself. Despite her young age, her ability to articulate her experience made her a powerful voice for the cause. Her mother, Lisa, often accompanied her to events, watching proudly as her daughter spoke confidently about the need for change. "Mia, what drives you to keep doing this?" a reporter asked during one interview. "I want other kids to know they're not alone," Mia replied. "And I want adults to understand that it's not just about what happens to me, it's about what happens to all of us." However, not everyone was on board. Officer Harris's supporters, those who believed in strict law enforcement, began to push back. Social media platforms filled with comments defending Harris, arguing that the arrest was justified and that Mia had been disruptive. "They should be taught discipline, not entitlement," one comment read. "These kids need to understand the importance of following rules." Another said, "It's not about racism, it's about order." If we let children act this way, society will collapse. Mia's supporters fought back fiercely, but the online battles were exhausting. Activism extended beyond the physical protests. The digital world became a battleground, filled with heated arguments and emotional exchanges. Back at City Hall, discussions around reform grew more intense. A new committee was established to review and improve policies concerning interactions between law enforcement and youth. Activists, parents, teachers, and even some police officers sat together, united by a common goal: to prevent tragedies like Mia's arrest from happening again. During one such meeting, a Black community leader voiced her concerns. "This isn't just a few bad officers. This is a system that disproportionately targets Black children. We need to fix the foundation, not just the surface." Heads nodded in agreement. Officers in the room looked uncomfortable, understanding the truth in her words. Though some still resisted change, the momentum for reform was undeniable. But Officer Harris watched these meetings from afar. His presence wasn't welcome in many spaces, and he didn't make attempts to insert himself into conversations. Instead, he chose to reflect on the words spoken, the emotions shown, and the reality of what his actions had caused. Late one evening, he sat in his apartment, scrolling through articles and videos related to Mia's case. He read about her interviews, her rallies, and her mother's powerful speeches. "How did I miss this?" he whispered to himself, feeling the weight of his oversight. In the community, Mia's story spread far beyond the town's borders. Activists from neighboring cities reached out, asking for her to share her experience at conferences and forums. Her story became a symbol, representing a larger movement for racial justice and accountability in policing. One evening, at a statewide conference on justice reform, Mia took the stage alongside activists, educators, and policymakers. The audience was diverse, composed of law enforcement officers, lawyers, community leaders, and students. "You may think this is about one girl's story," Mia began, her voice steady and powerful. "But it's not. It's about the thousands of children who have been arrested, suspended, and pushed out of the system simply because of the color of their skin. We deserve better." The applause was overwhelming. For many in the room, Mia's words became a call to action, a wake-up call to acknowledge and challenge systemic inequalities. Back in her small town, Mia returned home to a family that had become a cornerstone of the movement. Her parents made sure to support her through every step of the journey, shielding her from the worst of the criticism and encouraging her to stay strong. As for Officer Harris, his future was uncertain. The town demanded change, and reform wasn't a simple fix. For the first time in a long time, he understood what it meant to be on the other side of injustice. Not as the enforcer, but as someone who had contributed to it. The fight for justice continued, and in the end, it was clear that the voices, loud, persistent, and unrelenting, were making the difference. The town buzzed with activity. The recent wave of protests, discussions, and initiatives had sparked conversations in homes, schools, and workplaces. Yet while some embraced the change, others chose silence, a quiet refusal to confront uncomfortable truths. At school, Mia noticed the shift. Her classmates, though more mindful, still hesitated when it came to confronting racial issues head-on. Some avoided her gaze in the hallways, others whispered behind her back. The fear of speaking out lingered, especially among those who felt unsure or afraid of the backlash. One afternoon, as Mia sat alone in the library, her notebook open with half-finished poems and thoughts, her friend Jasmine approached her. "You okay?" Jasmine asked softly, sitting beside Mia. Mia sighed. "It's just hard sometimes. People act like they care, but when it gets uncomfortable, they pull back." Jasmine nodded. "It's like they want change, but only if it's easy. When it's messy, they don't know how to handle it." Mia closed her notebook and leaned back in her chair. "I'm used to the silence. People listen, but they don't hear me. They don't really see what's happening." Outside the library, Officer Harris sat in his car, watching the school building. He had tried avoiding the area, but his unease had drawn him back time and again. The sight of children laughing, playing, and learning reminded him of Mia's innocence and his failure to protect it. "I wanted to do my job," he muttered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tightly. "But not like this." His thoughts were interrupted by the sound of his phone vibrating. It was a message from an anonymous sender. "You can't run from this. Face the truth." He stared at the screen, his stomach twisting in discomfort. On Nawak in the community, the fight for justice continued to gain momentum. Town hall meetings were packed with residents demanding change. Activists presented proposals for community oversight of the police, fair disciplinary actions, and increased training for officers in handling youth interactions. One evening, Mia's mother, Lisa, stood before a group of town officials. "We need accountability, not just empty promises. Our children deserve to grow up feeling safe, not afraid." The room fell silent as her voice echoed through the chambers. "I see my daughter in every child who has been treated unfairly," Lisa continued, "and I refuse to stand by and watch this continue." Despite the growing support, there were still voices of resistance. Some community members dismissed the movement as radical or unnecessary. "We don't need reform," they argued. "The system works fine. The problem is a few bad apples, not the whole tree." At one meeting, a retired officer stood up. "These kids are being raised with too much entitlement. They don't understand discipline. That's the real issue." The room erupted in disagreement and voices clashed. Mia's name was frequently brought up, and while some defended her, others criticized her for being a symbol of disruption rather than a voice for change. Back in her bedroom, Mia scrolled through her social media feed, reading the comments, both supportive and harsh. Her heart ached as she saw how easily people dismissed her cause. But she remembered the moments that gave her strength, the rallies, the stories shared by other children, the adults who stood beside her. She paused at a message from a young boy named Jamal, who had been suspended for speaking up against racial slurs at school. "Thank you, Mia. You gave me the courage to tell my story. We're not alone." Mia smiled softly, knowing that despite the criticism, she wasn't fighting alone. There were others like Jamal, and together, they formed a growing movement, a collective voice that could not be silenced. One afternoon, Mia's father brought her to a small gathering in the community center, a space meant for discussions on racial equality and reform. Local leaders, teachers, parents, and students sat together in a circle, their expressions ranging from anger to hope. "Change doesn't come overnight," her father said, "but it starts with understanding and listening." Mia spoke last, her voice steady and calm. "We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for fairness, for respect, for change that acknowledges the truth." The room nodded in agreement, their spirits lifted by her words. Meanwhile, Officer Harris continued his silent observation. He attended no meetings, offered no opinions, and avoided interaction with anyone who might question him. But the weight of his silence became unbearable, and the anonymous messages persisted. One evening, he decided to confront his past actions. He pulled out his journal, something he hadn't done in years, and began writing. "I let my bias cloud my judgment. I saw Mia not as a child with rights, but as a disturbance to control. I was wrong." He stared at the words, feeling the sting of truth. The first step, he realized, was not about regaining trust. He needed to earn it. But how? In the community, trust-building efforts were underway. Police officers, activists, and citizens participated in workshops designed to bridge the gap between law enforcement and the community. These spaces were tense but necessary, allowing people to share experiences, fears, and hopes. One evening, Mia joined a group of officers for a youth police dialogue session. They sat in a circle, young and old, discussing real-life scenarios and how they could be handled differently. A middle school student named Rashid spoke up. "I've been followed home by the police just for walking while black. It's terrifying." The room grew quiet. Mia listened intently, her heart aching for Rashid's experience. She felt his pain as if it were her own. Officer Harris, sitting quietly in the corner, finally broke his silence. "I understand, and I am sorry." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. It was the first time he had publicly acknowledged his mistake, the first step toward understanding. The town buzzed with activity once again. The protests had shifted into collaborative efforts, committees formed, workshops held, and conversations sparked. Still, the work wasn't easy. Change rarely is. At school, Mia's classmates approached her more cautiously now. Some smiled hesitantly, while others avoided eye contact altogether. The tension was palpable. The conversation about race had become unavoidable, and for many it was uncomfortable. Jasmine, Mia's best friend, sat beside her in the cafeteria one afternoon. "Do you feel like things are different?" Jasmine asked, glancing around at the quiet murmurs of conversations about race. Mia shrugged. "Different, but not in the way I thought. People talk, but it feels like we're planting seeds that need time to grow." Jasmine nodded. "That's the thing. Change takes time, but we've started." Meanwhile, in City Hall, the Task Force for Police Reform met to review progress. Leaders from all sides, activists, parents, educators, and law enforcement, gathered to discuss the future of policing and youth interactions. "I believe we've made strides," said a community organizer, "but we still have a long way to go. Policy changes are essential, but they won't mean much if the mindset doesn't shift." Another activist added, "We need accountability at every level, starting from recruitment to everyday interactions." The room echoed with agreements and proposals, but not everyone was on board. Some officers felt that the conversations were becoming overly political, with too much focus on emotional responses rather than practical solutions. Back at her home, Mia sat in the living room with her mother, Lisa. The television buzzed in the background, but the two women were too engrossed in conversation to notice. "Mia, how do you feel about everything? The workshops, the dialogues?" Lisa asked, smoothing her daughter's hair with gentle fingers. Mia sighed, her voice thoughtful. "It's exhausting, but necessary. People want change, but they don't always know how to ask for it, or how to really listen." Lisa smiled warmly. "You're making a difference. I see it, even when it feels small. Every conversation, every step forward is important." Mia leaned into her mother's embrace, her worries dissipating for a moment. In the community, Officer Harris remained distant from the ongoing discussions. Though he continued attending mandated reform meetings, his presence was cold and withdrawn. The weight of guilt still hung heavily over him. One evening, as he drove through the town, he found himself near the park where Mia's arrest had taken place. The place was peaceful, children playing without fear, their laughter a stark contrast to the memories he couldn't erase. He parked the car and sat in silence, staring at the swing swaying gently in the breeze. "I'm trying," he whispered to no one in particular, "but it's not enough." Meanwhile, Mia's activism extended beyond her hometown. She was invited to speak at conferences, sharing her story with broader audiences. At one such event, she stood before a crowd of educators, policymakers, and activists from across the region. "I'm just a child," Mia began, her voice strong and clear. "But my story isn't unique. There are thousands of children who face unfair treatment because of the color of their skin. We can't keep ignoring it." The audience listened intently, nodding thoughtfully. Some wiped away tears while others clapped softly. Mia's words resonated deeply, stirring emotions and sparking commitments to change. In a small-town meeting, Officer Harris sat quietly in the back row, his hands fidgeting nervously. The conversation revolved around bias in policing, and he felt the scrutiny of everyone's gaze. One woman, an elder from the community, turned to him. "We've been told that silence isn't an option," she said softly. "Yet here you are, still quiet. How do you expect us to move forward when the person who caused so much pain is afraid to face it?" The room grew tense. Harris remained silent, unable to find the words to justify his actions. He knew they were right. Back in the school, Mia led a group of students in a workshop about racial justice. The room was filled with a mix of emotions, anger, hope, and sadness. She guided the conversation, encouraging her peers to share their experiences, fears, and hopes. "I'm tired of being afraid," one boy, Malik, admitted. "I shouldn't have to think twice about how I dress or where I walk. Why is that normal?" Mia nodded, her expression serious. "It's not normal. And it's not just about what happens in the moment. It's about changing how people see us, how they treat us. It's about breaking cycles." In the background, Officer Harris watched from the doorway. His hands were still trembling, but this time he stepped forward, his voice soft but steady. "I'm sorry," he said simply. The room fell silent as everyone turned to him. "I've been silent for too long, and I was wrong." Mia looked at him, her eyes wide with surprise. "Thank you," she said quietly. Outside, the sun was setting, casting an orange glow over the town. The air was filled with possibilities, whispers of change, seeds planted and beginning to take root. The fight for justice was far from over, but in that moment, there was a sense of progress, a glimmer of hope amidst the struggles. Mia walked home with her mother hand in hand, the sound of her voice mingling with the sounds of laughter and hope in the distance. The journey continued, and with each step forward, the world seemed to grow a little brighter. The days passed, but the weight of change didn't lessen. Mia continued to speak at events, attend community meetings, and participate in workshops. Her presence became a symbol of resilience, a reminder that no matter how young, voices like hers held power. However, the path forward wasn't easy, and with every step, new challenges arose. At school, Mia noticed a shift. Some of her peers who once avoided discussing race now engaged more openly. But alongside them, others still hesitated, afraid of saying the wrong thing or afraid of consequences. The atmosphere was tense, and it wasn't just about words anymore. It was about actions, about real change. One afternoon, Mia sat in her history class, watching her teacher write on the board. The topic was about civil rights movements, but today's lesson wasn't focused on the past. It was about linking those movements to the present. Civil rights didn't end with the 60s, Mr. Reynolds said, pacing the front of the classroom. They evolved, and the fight for equality continues. What do you all think about that? The room grew quiet. Some students fidgeted, others exchanged nervous glances. Mia raised her hand. It's true. History shows us how change happens, but it doesn't mean the battle is over. We're still fighting for those rights, and sometimes it feels harder now because the struggle is more subtle. Meanwhile, in the town hall, the Reform Committee was making progress, but slowly. Officers were undergoing new training designed to promote empathy and de-escalation, and policies were being revised to reflect a commitment to justice. Yet in the shadows, dissent still simmered. Officer Harris sat at the back of the room, his eyes scanning the group. Every meeting was a reminder of his mistakes, a haunting reflection of his past actions. Despite his attempts to contribute meaningfully, he struggled with how to rebuild trust. Every glance his way was filled with skepticism, if not outright distrust. One evening, Mia's family attended a town hall event where the topic was centered around police accountability. Lisa, her mother, spoke passionately about the importance of transparency and systemic reform. Mia's story wasn't an isolated incident, Lisa said firmly. It's part of a larger pattern that needs to be addressed, and we won't stop until the voices that have been silenced are heard. A few rows behind Lisa, Officer Harris watched intently, his hands clenched in his lap. He listened carefully, absorbing every word. The passion, the frustration, and the hope. It all echoed within him. Outside of formal meetings, Mia found ways to connect with people one-on-one. She spent time with her peers, having open conversations about race, justice, and the future. One evening, she invited a group of classmates to her home for a casual discussion. "Why do you think it's so hard to talk about race?" Mia asked, her voice soft and inviting. One of her classmates, Sarah, hesitated before speaking. "Because we don't want to offend anyone. We're scared of getting it wrong." "And that's okay," Mia said gently. "What matters is that you're trying. You're listening, and that's where it starts." Sarah nodded slowly. "But what if we listen and still don't understand?" "What then?" Mia smiled. "Then we keep asking questions. We keep learning. None of us has all the answers, but we can grow together." Back in the Reform Committee, Officer Harris took a more active role. He participated in workshops designed to foster understanding between law enforcement and the community. These sessions weren't easy. They were raw, filled with stories of pain, fear, and frustration. He listened to stories from parents who had lost children to police brutality, to educators who had witnessed the systematic exclusion of Black students, and to activists who had been fighting for decades for the same change. One afternoon, during a particularly emotional session, an older Black man stood up and faced Harris directly. "You may have sat through all of this," the man said, his voice shaking with emotion, "but how can we trust that you've truly changed?" Harris met his gaze, his own eyes filling with tears. "I don't expect trust overnight," he said quietly, "but I want to prove that I'm willing to learn, to listen, and to change. The room grew silent again, each person reflecting on his words. Some nodded in acknowledgement, while others were still skeptical. Meanwhile, Mia's voice continued to grow louder in different spaces. She attended statewide conferences, youth forums, and even spoke at the state capitol. Her speeches were powerful, a fusion of personal experiences and calls for systemic reform. Each time she urged the audience to remember the importance of action, not just words. "I don't need sympathy," Mia said at one conference. "I need accountability. I need justice. I need a system that sees me as human, not as a problem." Her words echoed through the hall, and many attendees stood to applaud, recognizing the truth behind her message. Back at school, the hallways felt slightly different. Teachers were more engaged in discussions about race and equality. Clubs and organizations focused on diversity and inclusion were thriving. Still, not everyone was ready to embrace change fully. One afternoon, Mia witnessed an altercation between two students. A white student had used a racial slur against a black student, and the tension was thick. Mia stepped in, her voice firm yet calm. "You can't undo your words," she said, addressing the aggressor. "But you can listen, you can learn." The other students gathered around, watching intently. Slowly, the aggressor nodded, a tear escaping his eye. "I didn't mean it that way. I didn't know." "You don't know until you listen," Mia replied. "And then, you make a choice to do better." In Officer Harris's mind, the moments like these stood out, the ones where understanding was achieved through shared experiences. They were slow moments of progress, but progress nonetheless. One evening after yet another long meeting, he sat in his car, staring at his reflection in the rearview mirror. "I'm not the same," he thought, "but change isn't about being perfect. It's about being willing." The town continued to move forward, a collection of voices, stories, and actions building bridges between past pain and future hope. Mia's voice, persistent and unyielding, stood at the forefront of that movement. And with every step, she reminded the community that silence had no place where understanding was needed. The town was slowly becoming a different place. Conversations about race and justice weren't easy, but they were happening, whether in schools, homes, or community spaces. People were beginning to listen more, to reflect more. The air felt charged with possibility, and though progress was slow, it felt real. At school, Mia's role as an activist had transformed how some students viewed her. Once seen as disruptive or too outspoken, she was now regarded as a leader, someone who spoke for those who felt unheard. Her classroom discussions on history and justice had sparked a desire for change in many of her peers. The town was in a state of constant motion. The wounds of the past hadn't fully healed, but they were no longer ignored. Conversations about racial justice continued to shape classrooms, town meetings, and everyday interactions. The progress was slow, but it was there, a steady shift toward understanding and accountability. Mia's voice grew louder and more determined with each passing day. She led more workshops, spoke at larger events, and participated in national forums on racial equity. Her activism extended beyond her hometown, inspiring youth across the region to take a stand for justice. One afternoon, Mia gathered with a group of young activists in a community center. The room was buzzing with ideas, debates, and shared experiences. "We need to be strategic," Mia said, her voice rising over the noise. "Every action we take should challenge the systems that uphold inequality." Her peers nodded in agreement. The collective energy in the room was palpable, and for the first time, there was a sense of organized purpose. They knew they weren't alone in their fight. Meanwhile, Officer Harris continued his journey of reflection and participation. Though his presence in the community had grown more accepted, the old doubts still lingered. He attended workshops, mediation sessions, and town halls, but the weight of his past mistakes was never far from his mind. One evening, during a discussion on implicit bias, a woman stood up and addressed Harris directly. "Every time you walk into a room, we see the face of the officer who arrested Mia," she said, her voice steady. "You may be here, but trust is earned, not given." Harris listened quietly, nodding slowly. "You're right," he said softly. "I don't expect you to trust me overnight, but I'm here to listen, to learn, and to be held accountable." The room grew tense, but her words sparked a conversation. Some agreed, while others remained skeptical. It was a reminder of the difficult road ahead. Back at school, Mia faced her own struggles. Not everyone appreciated her activism. Some teachers saw her as a disruption to the norm, while others supported her efforts. But Mia understood that her fight wasn't for popularity, it was for justice. One day after class, Mia found herself speaking to her history teacher, Mr. Reynolds. "Do you ever get tired?" he asked gently, his expression thoughtful. Mia shrugged, a faint smile on her face. "Tired, yes. But quitting? Never." Mr. Reynolds chuckled softly. "You're something else, Mia. You've given all of us a lesson in courage." In the town's police department, a new training program focused on community engagement and cultural sensitivity. Officers, including those who had once been resistant, were participating in workshops aimed at fostering empathy and understanding. Officer Harris was among them, his dedication to change evident in his willingness to engage deeply. One afternoon during a session, a young black woman named Layla shared her story. She spoke about her experience being racially profiled during a traffic stop and the emotional toll it took on her family. "I shouldn't have to fear interactions with the police," Layla said, her voice cracking. "But because of history, because of assumptions, I do." Officer Harris sat in the front row, his eyes glued to her every word. The weight of her story pressed heavily on his chest. "Thank you for sharing that," he said when she finished. "I can't take your pain away, but I can listen, and I will work to ensure it doesn't happen to someone else." Outside of formal spaces, Mia's activism was reaching new heights. She organized a local festival for racial justice, inviting artists, musicians, and speakers from diverse backgrounds. The event was a celebration of unity and change, with workshops, performances, and discussions centered around equity and community building. At the festival, Mia delivered a powerful speech about the importance of embracing one's identity and standing firm against injustice. "Every voice matters," she said into the microphone. "Every story counts. And together we are unstoppable." The crowd cheered, voices joining hers in a collective call for justice. However, the shadows of injustice continued to creep in. Late one night, Mia received a message from an anonymous source warning her to back off from her activism. "You're stirring up trouble," it read. "Stay quiet before something worse happens." Her hands trembled as she read the message. The fear was real, but so was her resolve. "Mia!" Her mother, Lisa, called out from the other room. "Everything okay?" Mia set the phone down and took a deep breath. "It's just another message. Nothing I haven't seen before." Lisa entered the room and sat beside her, her presence comforting. "You're not alone in this. We'll face this together." In another part of town, Officer Harris received a similar warning. A colleague had passed along a note cautioning him against getting too involved in reform efforts. "Stick to the basics," it read, "or risk losing everything." Harris sat in his dimly lit living room, his gaze fixed on the paper in his hands. His past choices had consequences, but the thought of stepping back was never an option. "I'm here to change the system, not to uphold it," he whispered to himself. The festival ended with a peaceful march through the town square. Mia led the way, her voice rising above the chants and drums. The march was a testament to the unity that had formed between activists, officers, educators, and everyday citizens. At the march's conclusion, Harris stood quietly at the edge of the crowd, watching Mia's strength in action. His heart swelled with pride and guilt, a mix of emotions that fueled his commitment. "Every step forward is a step closer to justice," he thought, his eyes fixed on Mia's figure ahead. "And I'll walk that path, no matter the cost." The path was fraught with challenges, but together they were building a future where the shadows of the past began to fade. The town had settled into a new rhythm, a delicate balance between progress and resistance. Conversations about race and justice continued to grow, but not without opposition. Mia's voice, once seen as disruptive, now carried weight. However, not everyone was ready to fully embrace the change. At school, Mia's days were filled with activism and academic challenges. Her teachers were more supportive, but there were still moments of tension. Some students resisted discussions about racial inequality, uncomfortable with the uncomfortable truths they were forced to face. One afternoon during a class discussion about privilege, a student named Jake raised his hand. "I get that there's a problem, but why do we have to keep talking about it? Isn't this just dividing us more?" he asked, his voice tinged with frustration. Mia paused before answering. "Ignoring the problem doesn't make it go away. Talking about it is the first step toward understanding." Jake remained silent, absorbing her words. Though he didn't fully agree, he couldn't dismiss her point entirely. In the community, the tension was palpable. Protests, marches, and town hall meetings became common, each event bringing new voices into the conversation. Officer Harris was a frequent presence at these gatherings, often sitting in the background, quietly listening and observing. His commitment to change remained strong, but the scrutiny was relentless. One evening, after a particularly heated discussion at a town hall about police accountability, a man approached Harris with folded arms and a stern expression. "You're not one of us," the man said bluntly. "You'll never be one of us." Harris met his gaze, steady and calm. "I'm here to learn, to understand, and to earn trust. You don't have to believe me now, but I won't stop trying." The man walked away, his words lingering in the air like a heavy fog. Harris knew it would take time to chip away at the skepticism, but his resolve only deepened. Mia's activism began to spark conversations beyond the town. She was invited to speak at a statewide youth conference, where young leaders from across the region gathered to discuss social justice. The stage was large and the room was packed. As she stepped up to the microphone, the room fell silent. "Our voices matter," Mia began, "but our actions? That's what creates change. We can no longer sit in silence. We must speak and we must act." Her words resonated with the crowd, inspiring a new wave of youth activists. Her story, her journey, had become a source of hope and determination for many. Back at home, Lisa watched her daughter's influence grow. Mia's passion had ignited a spark in her peers, and though the journey was challenging, Lisa felt a sense of pride and admiration for her resilience. One evening, as they sat in the living room, Lisa shared her thoughts. "You've become a leader," Lisa said quietly, "but don't let the weight of that responsibility crush you. You're still growing, and that's okay." Mia smiled, leaning into her mother's embrace. "I know, but every step forward is worth it." Meanwhile, Officer Harris was invited to speak at a reform seminar for law enforcement. The event was attended by officers, community leaders, and activists. The room was filled with tension as Harris took the stage. "I'm not here to defend my past," he began. "I'm here to own it. My mistakes have consequences, and I've seen firsthand how those mistakes have hurt this community." The room grew quiet. Some nodded, others still watched him with suspicion. "I'm learning from those mistakes," he continued, "and I will continue to work toward a future where no one feels unsafe or unjustly treated." After the seminar, a young black woman approached Harris. Her expression was neutral, but her words were sharp. "I don't need apologies," she said. "I need action. I need results." Harris held her gaze steadily. "You're right, and I'm here to work for those results, not just talk about them." Outside these events, the ripple effects of Mia's activism were evident. More schools introduced courses on social justice, more communities hosted discussions about race, and more institutions began revising policies to reflect inclusivity. The change wasn't immediate, but it was spreading. However, resistance remained. Rumors circulated, misinformation was spread, and the weight of doubt pressed down on those pushing for reform. One evening, Mia's family received threats through social media, a cruel reminder that the fight wasn't over. Mia read the messages silently, her jaw clenched. "It won't stop us," she said firmly, her voice steady despite the fear. "They can't erase our truth." Lisa placed a comforting hand on her shoulder. "You're stronger than they know." In a quieter moment, Officer Harris sat in his car, reflecting on the day's events. The weight of responsibility sat heavy on his shoulders, but so did the progress they had made. "We've come a long way," he thought, "but there's still so much more to do." The road ahead was filled with challenges, but together Mia and those who stood with her were shaping a future where justice was no longer a dream. It was a reality. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden glow over the town square. The final rays of light stretched across the cobblestone streets, illuminating the faces of the people gathered there. Today was a day of celebration, a culmination of months, no, years of hard work, resilience, and unwavering determination. Mia stood at the forefront, her voice steady and strong as she addressed the crowd. Beside her was Officer Harris, his expression calm and reflective, a symbol of change that had once seemed impossible. Together they represented the bridge between past wounds and the hope of a better future. Today we stand not as enemies, not as opposites, Mia began, her voice carrying through the air. We stand as neighbors, as a community that understands the power of unity. We've fought, we've cried, we've bled, but we've also grown stronger. And together we've proven that change is not only necessary, it's possible. The crowd erupted into cheers, applause filling the square with energy. Families, friends, activists, teachers, and officers were united in a shared vision, a vision of justice, equity, and healing. Officer Harris stepped forward, his presence steady and reflective. I've made mistakes and I've been humbled by them, but those mistakes don't define me. It's the actions I take now, the work I continue to do, that matters. And with each step forward, I aim to walk beside you, not ahead or behind. A wave of silence followed his words, a quiet moment where understanding settled over the crowd. It was a moment of recognition, of forgiveness, and of shared responsibility. Mia turned to him, offering a gentle smile. We all carry the weight of the past, but we also carry the strength to shape the future. And that future? It's one where every voice is heard, every injustice is challenged, and every person is valued. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the square. But the warmth of unity persisted, filling every corner of the gathering. Suddenly, a child's laughter rang out, clear and joyful, breaking through the emotional silence. It was simple, yet powerful, a reminder that the next generation would inherit the lessons of today, the seeds of change planted by those who refused to accept the status quo. Mia turned toward the crowd, her voice rising with conviction. Our journey doesn't end here. It continues through education, advocacy, and compassion, and no matter how hard the road may be, we'll walk it together. Officer Harris looked out at the sea of faces, each one filled with hope and determination. His eyes met Mia's, and in that shared glance, an unspoken understanding passed between them. They had come from different places, but now they stood united in purpose. As the final light of day faded, a hush fell over the square. The crowd stood still, absorbing the moment, the culmination of struggle, perseverance, and unity. And as they dispersed into the evening, each person carried with them the memory of what had been achieved. A new chapter was written, not just in history books, but in the hearts and minds of a community reborn. In that moment, the seeds of change had grown into something more, a powerful living legacy of hope, justice, and the unwavering belief that together they could create a future where no one is left behind.